Hello, everybody. This is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values. I'm delighted to have with us today really one of my intellectual heroes, Peter Boghossian. You probably heard a lot about Peter recently. If you've been paying attention, Peter just left the Portland State University, where he was a philosophy professor. He's a public intellectual. He's been involved in the New Atheist movement for a long time. Peter is starting a new group called the National Progress Alliance, which we're looking forward to hearing about. And he's written a book, which you can find on Amazon, called How to Have Impossible Conversations, which is a great read. Peter, thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, David. I appreciate your having me and having this conversation. It's so important.
Yeah. So you stuck it out a long time at Portland State University when you were under fire, where there were investigations and the like. What made you decide at this moment finally to leave that and to go in different directions?
Well, it had been a long time coming, frankly, and there was a single instant in which I decided that, but that was before the pandemic, and as you know, the pandemic changed everything for everybody. There was an instant where I attempted to have a conversation with the president of the university for 5 minutes, and I was told repeatedly that he was too busy. And I had been working there for 10 years, and I had been nobody could possibly accuse me of not having done enough or not having asked the right questions or what have you. So I finally managed a brief meeting with the dean, and I brought up to him, and you can fact check this with a link, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education's Portland State University made the top 10 list of the worst colleges for free speech in 2020. And I told him that this was deeply concerning to me, that we've created an illiberal and censorious culture. And he looked at me in no uncertain terms, said, it's a good thing to be on that list. And so the key deliverable there is that was a remarkable moment for me. And that this was I think one of the themes that might emerge in this conversation is that this is a feature and not a bug of the ideology.
So let's get into the ideology a little bit. I know it's characterized in different ways and different names, and it's on campus, but it's not confined to campus anymore. How would you characterize this ideological moment, both on and off campus?
Well, first let's talk about the names, because you're correct. It goes by different names, and that's part of the problem. And so it used to be called Wokism, and people who participate or in the orbit of woke ideology don't like the term woke anymore. You often find it from people on the other side of the intellectual, well, I don't want to say ideological spectrum, but for those, because that's a very diverse group of individuals. Then sometimes it goes by social justice with an uppercase S and an uppercase J, and that's to be distinguished from lowercase s and lowercase j social justice. So in cynical theories, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay call it critical social justice. The reason I'm spending so much time on this is because the terms that we use are important. And one of the reasons that people have been hoodwinked by this is because they'll think, well, social justice, who wouldn't want social justice? I'm for social justice. And so what you call it is really important in this conversation as you proceed forward. So we could call it, critical social justice or what have you, but it means different things depending on the term that one uses. Like woke, for example, is become a pejorative.
Right. And I know Wesley Yang likes to call it the
successor ideology. Yeah, that's a wonderful phrase, and he's done a fantastic job explaining that. So there are features. This is a suite of conclusions, and to a certain extent, it's a suite of epistemologies, like lived experience, how we come to our knowledge, and it's a combination of almost negative epistemologies, or I don't know how deep you want to go in the conversation, but it's casting you want to go deep on the conversation?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So it's casting a moral pox on many ways that we have traditionally come to knowledge. Science, reason, epistemic adequacy, dialogue, discourse, the scientific method, the Socratic method. And so those epistemologies are ways of coming to know the world, or tools that we use to create institutions, et cetera. Those those mechanisms are not claimed that they're bad on epistemological grounds. They're claimed that they're bad on moral grounds, right? Because you can use dialogue and discourse, for example, to hurt people's feelings or create offense or make people feel not welcome or make people feel not included. So in one sense, there's it offers an epistemology or a way to view the world, a way to come to knowledge, and then it has it morally castigates other epistemologies. But it's also a set of conclusions that people come to about, systems. Kendi talks about this. The best-selling authors talk about this quite a bit, that racism is inherently baked into the system, that we're all racist. But even then, you need to disambiguate the term racism. And so it's as D'Angelo says, it's the ordinary everyday state of affairs. As Kendi says in Ta-Nehisi Coates, any disparity in outcomes has to be due to systems. So this is it's not particularly complex, but it's a broad, it makes a lot of claims about the world and reality in regard to race, gender, oppression, sexual orientation, trans status, identity markers, et cetera. So it's a big question.
Yeah. So is there a more, at least in theory, a more moderate form of this, whereby someone can say, I'm going to take a systems level analysis of racism, and I'm going to believe that there's racism embedded in certain systems, but not in others. But I'm not going to buy into the epistemological claim that means that says that only people with the right lived experience have the right to articulate this for the rest of society. And I'm just going to use that systems level analysis as part of my larger theory of how the world works. I mean, can you imagine that being accepting a sort of form of critical race theory that didn't go so far as to make such aggressive truth claims?
There's a lot. You said a lot there. One of the things you said is, I'm going to believe that racism inherent in some systems and not in others. So why would you even start with, I'm going to believe that?
Right. Well,
So
right.
Yeah.
Not that I'm going to believe that, but can one, and I'm sorry I didn't state that very clearly, can one say, I have a sense that, and I'm going to investigate it, I'm going to explore it, that there is racism embedded in certain systems and not in others. I'm not going to accept the idea that America is pervasively racist or all systems are racist, but I'm going to look system by system.
So here's the issue there. The issue is, what tools are you going to use? What tools are you going to use when you go system by system to analyze?
I'm going to see what evidence that might suggest that there's racism in a system.
Okay. Now, I don't mean to grief you here, but the devil is in the details, if you'll excuse that expression. So you're going to see if there's racism in a system by using evidence, but what's your threshold for evidence? Like, what do you think constitutes sufficient evidence so that a reasonable person looking at the system would think it's sufficient to warrant belief? In other words, what I'm trying to get to here, I'll just be expeditious because it's an important question, is, to what role does lived experience play in the analysis?
Right. Well, I might be able to listen to somebody's lived experience. In other words, I want to know what it is, and I'll take that in account as one data point of many. But I also might look at, were any of the policymakers involved in creating that system prejudiced, or were they explicitly prejudiced? And is there any evidence of that? Is there any evidence?
Evidence. See, you smuggled that in again. I mean, really, the devil really is in the detail about how we articulate these things. So I guess the question then is, what do you do? How do you adjudicate a conflict between lived experience and data? Actual, like survey data or statistical data that's come about as a result of a time-honored process.
I argue with other people who are looking at both and try to come to the best conclusion I can. I know I can't come to a perfectly clear conclusion because it's ultimately it's probably not falsifiable, but I can say, okay, given what I've heard in your lived experience, given what I've seen in the various forms of evidence, including statements that public officials and others might have made at various times, I'll do my best in trying to come to a conclusion about whether it's systemic racism is a factor.
So I'll throw an alternative epistemology out to you. And then let's drill down on an example. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So let's say that we have the unequivocal testimony. Just thinking that phrase unequivocal testimony is a line in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The unequivocal testimony that yogins claim to have died and re-entered the human womb consciously. But okay, bracketing that for a second. Let's say that we have the unequivocal testimony of people who sincerely claim to be pulled over by the police disproportionately. And the assumption is that that's on the basis of their skin color. I would argue that that doesn't constitute sufficient reason to believe the claim, but it's certainly a very good reason to investigate the claim and to use the tools of science to see. So, for example, you would correlate, body cam information. I'm not in law enforcement, but I would assume that, when they call in, they have a license and people self-identify their race, and we look at the percentage of contact with the there are ways to do that, but lived experience would be a reason to initiate an investigation to make sure that we're forming just systems. It wouldn't be sufficient to constitute evidence in terms of adjudicating between, if you have a mountain of evidence of we have all these calls to dispatch, and what percentage of these are African Americans and what percentage of these are non-African, Asians, or what have you. And so I think if there's ever a conflict between the data, you need to look. So this is why science is so important. This is why reason and evidence is so important, is that we just can't run around being held hostage to the lived experiences of people. But at the same time, we need to genuinely and sincerely listen to those lived experiences and use those to formulate thoughtful investigations for how we formulate public policy and how we treat people justly and fairly. But lived experience alone, what we see is, is a feature of the ideology. Lived experience alone is not sufficient to warrant belief in many of the claims, and also should not be upon. We can't base entire public policies based upon people's lived experience.
Absolutely.
We have to have evidence.
Right. Well, I think that it would be nice to be able to have these dialogues in writ large in society, where we could actually explore claims of racism in particular systems and really go through that process that you just went through. And unfortunately, I think the current ideological environment really stifles that very discussion.
Correct. And even, let's linger on that for a second. So even that suggestion is viewed as itself a racist, bigoted, homophobic, misogynist. But that's the problem, is that when you start with the assumption that a person is that because of some immutable characteristic they have, then you're always going to find it, right? You're always going to find it. But if you start with that assumption, then you can never really build just or fair institutions. It's not possible, because the starting assumption is that no matter what you build, it's inherently racist.
Right. Another fallacy that I hear is that you'll take some aspect of the sort of legacy of racism and project forward and argue that that still exists today. So, for example, redlining. It's a situation where the government moved certain categories of people into specific areas, and now they live in undesirable areas, and that's perpetuating a cycle of poverty and crime and the rest. And you could say, okay, that happened however many years ago, 5-6 decades ago. The question is, to what degree is that an explanatory factor for today's disparity?
Yes. And the other vital question in that is not only to what degree, is how is that remediated? And that's when you need the idea of equity. And so equity would say there's been an unjust and radically disproportionate accumulation of wealth by certain individuals on the basis of their skin color. And so how do we remediate that, like going forward, to make up for those past injustices? What do we do? We have a tax on white people? Do we have reparations? Do we have, what do we, I'm just throwing out some ideas.
Sure.
The key is to not only identify the places in which this is happening, it's that we're so fractured and so divided now that I think the vast majority of people want fair systems. They want systems they can trust, which we don't have now. We have a crisis of legitimacy in our institutions. The question is how to achieve that, and what role equity in particular, as opposed to equality, should play in systems. This is a very, very complicated question, but no matter what side of the coin you land on, the answer is identical for how you get there, is you have to talk to people. You have to be willing to have conversations with people who have fundamental disagreements with you. And we have to make systems in which having those conversations is not, you're not castigated or thrown out or investigated or punished. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. Because anything else that you would say, you'd have to claim some kind of revelation, like God revealed to you that we need equity in our institutions, or, you just have to pick up a pitchfork and start killing people.
Right. I want to move on to a second about what got you into sort of fighting the imposition of ideology and fighting for liberalism. You were really known as a new atheist for a long time. And, I heard you on numerous podcasts and the like. And now it seems that the atheism industry, if you will, has been sort of divided into two. There's sort of the people who continue to push for woke ideology. And there are people like you and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, who are sort of opposed to that.
Not sort of, but yes.
Very opposed to it in your case, and in Sam's case, and Richard's case. And I'm wondering how that has changed the nature of your political commitment compared to where you were, I don't know, even 5-10 years ago.
That's a fantastic question. It's not really. I mean, fundamentally the same person. I have fundamentally the same beliefs and ideas. I mean, I've tweaked ideas in the last few years, of course. I think I have, how do I want to say it? I think I have, I don't want to say they're unshakable commitments, because that would mean that I wouldn't be willing to revise them. But I've deepened my commitment and my understanding of the importance of some values like freedom of speech and how those are derived. I've also, one of the things I've realized is that, and I published a piece, and maybe it can be posted there, about the Great Realignment. Metaphysics now in this culture war plays much less of a role than it did. And so I'm very friendly with many people who are conservative Christians, Rob Dreher, and I respect his work, even though we disagree about metaphysics. But the role of, are there supernatural entities? Did some guy walk on water? Jews chosen? All that stuff. It's a joke I make with all my Jewish friends who are being chosen. All of those things are just not important now, right? They're not important because they seem almost trivial in relation to the death of Western civilization.
Right. Yeah, it would seem that if you're fighting this bigger fight about liberalism, about the fundamental operating system of our society, your differences on a lot of other issues just pale in comparison to those.
Yeah. But it's not just that the differences are pale in comparison. It's that there's more of a difference between, this is a very weird idea. It's a very weird way to think about this. There's more of a difference between wokism and non-wokism than there is between atheist and theist. In many cases, that's not perfect, but the tools, for example, like Robbie George from Princeton, or the tools that many people use to come to the truth, the epistemologies are the same. Conversation, argumentation, maybe even debate. You dispute a claim, you look for the evidence, you come. In the new culture war, the rules of engagement are the same. So in the old culture war, for just to use as one example with Richard, creationists would want to debate him. They think he's wrong, they'd call him out, but they wouldn't say that he's a rapist. They wouldn't demand that his PhD be taken away. They wouldn't get mobs. Of course, they didn't have the mechanisms of social media that enabled those, they didn't have the technologies that enabled them to do that, but they wouldn't blow bullhorns at his events. They'd let him speak because they have better arguments. So even that alone makes those two, in that one pedestrian example of creationism, brings those two ideological reality tunnels, if you will, closer together than not. It's a weird way to think about it, but it's actually true.
Yeah, fascinating. So one argument that I've heard from more religious friends of mine who agree with us on the threat of wokeism is that we've seen religion itself sort of decline on the American scene, and that hasn't been replaced with critical thinking capacity. It's been replaced with other ideologies like woke ideology, other dogmas that just have replaced in people's minds what maybe organized religion might have at one point, and that's actually worse because wokeism is less calibrated for sort of Western democracy than Christianity and Judaism are. And so I guess the question I have is, to what degree do you?
Can you pause before the question, please? Because I want to unpack that just a little bit. So that's called the substitution hypothesis. I don't know if we came up with this, someone came up with this, but the substitution hypothesis is that everybody has a baseline of the architecture of belief, the engine, the way that the brain works, and the way that we formulate our beliefs. The substitution hypothesis is if you remove, so the brain is the hardware and the software are the cultural inputs that come in. And so we're all going to believe something. And so when the traditional religions die, something else comes in. If you have seen Game of Thrones, the only reason about the old gods, the only reason you need a new gods are because people start believing in the old gods. Right. So that you have this idea that there's a kind of a baseline of superstitious and supernatural belief. And so Plato actually writes about this in the Republic as well. So ought we not then, given that if that's true, the substitution hypothesis is true, then ought we not to, shouldn't we just push people toward more benign beliefs? And the part of the problem in conceptualizing this is that there's a kind of weird relativism or even weird egalitarianism, even those things conflict about the nature of religious beliefs. Not all religious beliefs are the same. Right. So if we lose the traditional structures, like if we lose belief in Christianity is decreasing, that's been now consumed by wokeism. And then on top of that, you have, for example, woke Pentecostals, with the Southern Baptists, woke Southern Baptists. So yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to use that idea of a substitution hypothesis to explain the phenomenon.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor. So are we, John McWhorter likes to characterize wokeism as a religion, and certainly it seems that there are certain religious aspects of it. To what degree do you see it as a religion?
Yeah, I co-published a piece, I think in 2014, in which I said that, we said that privilege is the original sin. And so just as Christians have original sin, woke people have privilege. The difference, though, again, this is drilling down a little more on the idea that not all belief systems are the same. You can be redeemed from original sin through the blood of Christ. You cannot be redeemed from your privilege or from your skin color. So there's no question that there are similarities between religious belief, political correctness, and blasphemy laws, and there's no question that it's the same. I think if you look at this, how it's institutionalized in a larger context, we see universities. I used to say that the universities are no longer a symposium where, from the ancient Greece, where people came and they disputed ideas and drank wine and argued, etc. But they've become churches, and the tools of the new churches are catechisms. And so really, in some senses, in the more extreme senses, they're like madrasas. And so you see the manifestation of this religion as it's swallowed up wholesale our academic institutions. And part of that, by the way, getting back to what I said before, is that the tools of reason and dispensation, et cetera, are absent from that.
It seems to me, just in this last week, that things have gotten nuttier and nuttier. ACLU put out a statement by Ruth Bader Ginsburg where they substituted any reference for women to they and them pronouns and the like, which just seems really, really crazy. Scientific America put out an article about the term Jedi, which refers to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and said they should stop using the term Jedi because the Jedi in Star Wars were really not good people. There was the Urban Institute. The Urban Institute in this last week put out some kind of paper which basically accused traditional scientific method as being white supremacist in nature.
Correct.
So how does this not end up just sort of consuming itself in its sheer absurdity? I'm still waiting for the backlash, and I don't see it yet. What's your feeling on that?
All right, it's coming. So let's go to what you said first, and then we'll go to the second half of what you said. So the first thing you said, I've seen it. I think you're absolutely correct, and you've mentioned it on the short term, and I've seen the long arc of this, and the long arc of this. It says, Martin Luther King said, "Moral arc bends towards justice." The arc of this ideology is it bends towards increasing idiocy and absurdity and the damaging of our institutions. And so I'm trying to think. So I'll just say this. So I was thinking about writing another set of papers, another set of fake papers, bogus papers. And then every once in a while, I'll see something in the literature when I'm reading, I'm thinking, wow, that's like even crazier than what I thought. Right. And then months later, I'll read something again, and I'm just like, my God, that's like, it never in our wildest dreams could we have thought, the Jedi things. People would have thought that was just so crazy that there'd just be no possible way that you could get that in. So there's no question that it's accelerating. It's been also called, the way to end this is called accelerationism. So you just want to just keep embracing the crazy until enough people realize that this is just, well, we know that it's unsustainable. That's not a question. The question is, what damages will it do to our institutions? Many of the people promulgating this nonsense, if they don't like the United States as the hegemon, they're in for a big surprise. They're in for a big treat when they see the new hegemon. It's like the Who song, "Meet the Old Boss," same as the old boss. I think it's, but anyway, I won't get into 70s, 80s music. Big fan of that. I've been re-listening to a lot of the old music I used to listen to as a kid. But
we're probably around the same age, so it's probably the same music I listen to.
Yeah, I'm 55. I've rediscovered
54.
YouTube. I've been listening to a lot of YouTube. I'm like, wow, that's really, really good. But anyway,
good stuff.
Yeah. So the question is, it's interesting. I saw a skimmed a piece of Johnny Depp coming out against cancel culture, and he's an A-list movie actor, and he said, I've been canceled. This is terrible, et cetera. And, look, good for him. Anytime anybody has a change of mind, they should be rewarded. It's interesting. Plato says, or Socrates says in the first 3 books of the Republic, I don't remember the exact quotation, but something like, it is not the fear of doing, but of suffering wrong that calls forth the reproaches of those who revile injustice. In other words, it's not the, when you're committing an injustice, it's no problem. It's only when it happens to you that you start saying, hey, wait a minute, It's unfair. But it's interesting how so many people will speak out about this only after it happens to them, but they won't be prophylactic as they see people. I was just on a call the other day, and something completely insane happened. So this guy was, evidently he was Mexican guy working on I can't remember the exact details, but he was driving along and making just, moving his fingers, how you do that when it's, and a reporter, someone was behind him with a camera and took a picture of him. And evidently he was making that sign that I think originated on 4chan. That when I was a kid, it used to be the okay, I'm not even going to do it because then I'll, it used to be the okay symbol. And then everyone is claiming he's a white supremacist now, and he lost his job, and he's getting kicked out of his house, and it's crazy. So, I mean, it's happening to so many people in so many walks of life that are clearly not racist or bigoted or any of these things. And I don't know. I mean, one of the things that is so alarming to me is the Overton window has moved so dramatically that what was completely crazy, you couldn't even entertain idea. They were unthinkable. And now they're just a commonplace.
Right. So I cannot not ask you about the grievance study affair, which you just referenced. I remember, I have to tell you, this is, reading about the conceptual penis and just dying laughing. I sent it to a bunch of friends of mine. This is before I understood who was doing it and where it came from and who you and Helen and Jim were and all that. And it seems that, obviously that got a lot of attention. And I posted it after you left, you announced you're leaving Portland State University. I posted that on Facebook, and some people read it and they said, they sort of dismissed it as saying, well, you wrote to these sort of these journals that absolutely have zero standing, that have no import, that you really weren't exposing anything commonplace within the university. How would you respond to that?
Well, we did respond to that. We responded to that with the Grievance Studies project. So there were very legitimate criticisms there of the conceptual penis, and I would urge people to read that. And if people do smoke marijuana and it's legal in your state, it's probably a very, very good party activity. So people said, look, this doesn't prove what you think it proves. To prove what you think it proves, you need to do A, B, C, D, E. And so I turned to my writing partner and said, oh, this is awesome. They've given us a roadmap. Let's do A, B, C, D, E, and let's publish in better journals. Let's publish these ideas. We got to know the literature. We truly did our homework. We did deep dives. And then we published, before the Wall Street Journal busted us, we published 7 papers. And so the grievance study, or Sokol Squared as it's called, that identified the problem. And James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose's book, Cynical Theories, explained the problem. And now each of us are doing things to address the problem. So, for example, Helen Pluckrose has Counterweight, and that's an organization. Yeah, thank you for posting those links. I appreciate it. Helen Pluckrose has a Counterweight, and that's a organization for people who have been damaged by critical social justice or wokeism or what have you. And just today, I liked a video on Twitter of somebody talking about his experience of being accused of racism. He's a firefighter. And James Lindsay has done new discourses, and that's something I want to pause on for a second. So and if you could post this too, it's translations from the Wokish. So he has done a very deep dive in the literature, and yes, thank you. Translations from the Wokish is if you just put in a term to the Social Justice Encyclopedia, and it will tell you the actual reference of where the term is used in the literature, and then it will give a commentary. I have a new thing, National Progress Alliance, and one of the things I'm doing is similar to what New Discourses has done with the Social Justice Encyclopedia, is I've made 1-minute videos. We should be releasing those around October 1st or 4th. And we'll release a few videos a week. They're just 1-minute videos when someone a woke person says cis, what do they mean? When a woke person says houseless, what do they mean? When a woke person says minoritized, what does that mean? And so in plain everyday language. But that was the trajectory. The trajectory was identify the problem in the grievance studies thing. These are bodies of literature that are corrupted. And if you put up the idea laundering, I think that will help. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please putting up the diluted departments piece. So it was the identification of the problem, thank you, from Sokol Squared to explaining the problem in Cynical Theories to each of us now doing our own thing to address that.
Right. So explain idea laundering a bit, of how ideas go in and come out as knowledge in the academic world.
So what happens is a bunch of people get together, and I talked about this. People find this idea fascinating. I talked about this idea on Barry Weiss's podcast.
Yes, you did.
Did you listen to that, Barry's podcast?
I did. Yep. It was great.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, she's amazing. So people will have an idea that, or they'll have a moral impulse, and they're an academician. So they're in the academy, they're a professor, what have you. They'll get together with other people who have similar moral impulses. They'll make a journal. They'll start writing about ideas in the journal. And I think the Barry one is the Weiss family is the best family. I think
right.
That's the one we use. And so all of these articles about the Weiss family being the best family will be punished. So it will go in as an idea or a moral impulse, and it will come out as knowledge. And then when you ask people how they know something, they'll point to something in the literature. But that's just been laundered. That's not knowledge. And so that's one of the ways that the ideology has managed to gain traction.
Right. So I want to just go into the road ahead and maybe end on that as well. It seems sometimes I'm optimistic, like, hey, we're finally building a movement to oppose this ideological monopoly. On other days, I think there's a whole generation of people already schooled in this, and how are we going to really extricate them from an ideal, or enough of them, a critical mass of them, so where we're able to have open conversations again? Where do you come down on this? What do you think the road ahead is?
The road ahead is arduous. It's dark. We don't really know what's happening. We do know that the ideology is unsustainable. We do know that the more insane it gets, the more backlash from just normal everyday people. We know that it's causing schisms in the country, red, blue lines. Now we have the whole vaccination thing, which is yet another schism that it's causing. We know that it's causing us to look through the lens of race when we shouldn't be looking at the lens of race. Just ask yourself, are racial relations better off now than they were 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 50? You're old enough to know, right? We're old enough to know. So we also have to acknowledge that there have been egregious injustices racially against groups of people, against homosexuals, etc. There's just, again, nobody is denying that, or maybe not nobody, but virtually nobody is denying that. The question is, what do we do about it, and how do we move forward from that? And the only way that we can, so this is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that the tool to figure out how to move forward, the people advancing the ideology don't want the tool used, because that's why should we listen to Nazis? Why it's privilege, called privilege preserving epistemic pushback. People are just going to want to preserve their privilege, so they're just going to say things that keep them in their privilege. Derek Bell from Harvard Law has talked about that too. The only reason that whites would be for granting a black's rights is if it somehow served their own interest. So the very thing that we need to get out of the trap, for example, science, data, reason, evidence, to turn toward the objective, it's been removed from helping us solve the problem. And the other thing that's been removed is the first step to solving any problem is to be honest about it. And we cannot openly voice, and there have been many studies and statistics, et cetera. In fact, I posted one about what's happening, something on college campuses. We're not being honest about the nature of the problem. And people are afraid to speak up. And where people should be doing this is in university classrooms. And people should be taught the tools, the Socratic method, maybe even debate, and even within the context of debate, debating, starting, this is a simple pedagogical tool, giving everybody, 4 or 5 things, trans bathrooms, whatever it is, and then writing down their opinion about this, going to the board, and then flipping it. And so you have to then debate the issue you don't agree with. Like that's not pedagogically revolutionary. I did that. My professors did that with me when I was in college. But so we don't have access to the tools to fix the problem. We're not honest about the problem. We have institutional mechanisms to prevent people from speaking out, or even the threat of those mechanisms, the threat of yet another investigation, or the diversity board, or somebody has said something that's offended to somebody. And there's been some really interesting institutional punishments that have been handed down for people who question the orthodoxy. I'm saying all of this to say that we shouldn't be Pollyanna about this. We need to be honest about the difficulty in the road ahead. So before I go on, I gave you a lot there. Do you have anything you want to unpack or say to that?
Yeah, I still feel like, okay, yes, there's a tremendous amount. The woke forces have basically taken away our ability to have conversations, which is very hard, which means that it's very hard to go out and reclaim a conversation if it's been taken away. But I still don't. It still seems hard to figure out where we go from here. How do you reinstall that software? Okay,
so we got to build this. So it's not the reason that it's bad if you don't have conversation is that you can never keep your own ideas in check. Right? It's a famous Feynman quote: "The easiest person to fool is yourself." You can never have a way of knowing if you're participating in a mass delusion. And so
Right.
one of the ways is when you don't have conversations with people you don't agree with, or with whom you have substantive disagreements, you're basically robbing yourself of an opportunity to figure out what's true. And you're robbing them of an opportunity to figure out what's true. And so there's a whole infrastructure in place. Oh, we don't talk to him. That's platforming.
Right.
And then there's guilt by association. Well, this guy, he talked to this guy, so I'm not going to talk to him. Again, all of those are ways for the ideology to keep itself positioned. So it's not the problem. Yes, is there a problem with not having conversations? Yes, but the reason that's a problem is because how you have to live with people in a society. At the very least, you should seek to understand. This is Jürgen Habermas, German philosopher position. You should seek to understand what they're saying. You should seek to really try to figure out their reasons. So So this is not just a problem because we're not talking to each other. This is a problem because, it's ruining our friendships. We're failing to create institutions okay. So all of that bracketed, I just wanted to linger on this because I don't want to rush through the conversation. So where do we go from here is, I've spoken about this. I gave a talk in London I think it was called The Road Ahead or The Way Forward. There's so much to do. Okay, so this is a massive thing. I mean, that's all I think about now. So the first order of business is you just have to, if it's at a meeting, you just have to show up to the meetings, and nobody wants to show up. And if you look at the videos I've mentioned many times, the Benjamin Boyce videos, when he does the equity summit and watch, there are only like 4 or 5 people who go to these meetings, right? And so I've been talking to people here in Washington, in Oregon. I've been talking to people here about in the Senate. There are only so many people who go to these. So you need to go to these, put a mask on or what have you, or if they're online, do that. Capture them on video if you can. So you need to document, you need to show up, 1, document, 2. You need to expose, 3, if they give any handouts or what have you, take pictures of those. Often people don't believe what's happening. And part of the reason they don't believe what's happening is because they don't believe that people actually believe what they say they believe. Oh, and there's another piece, if you wouldn't mind posting from the Wall Street Journal. It's social justice warriors won't listen, but you should. So even if someone won't listen to you, you should listen to them. And one of the reasons that you want to listen to them is because you want to model that behavior. But the other reason that you want to listen to them, because you want to see what they actually believe, right? So the only way you can really know what someone believes is how they act and when you ask them if they believe something. And that is really important. And I'm working on some things to help that. So we have an institution level of showing up, documenting, going to YouTube like Jody Shaw did. We have a personal level of Jody Shaw was the woman from Smith College who did an amazing video. I have a few requests, and if people haven't seen that, I would urge them to watch this. Just a very heartfelt video, and it was just a very honest video of what she did was not only a remarkable act of courage, but anybody who has courage can do something like that, given that we have the tools technologically to do that now. Like YouTube is just a great vehicle for that. And then on a personal level, we have to start listening to each other again. We have to start talking to each other again. And when you hear something, repeat back to them. Is this what you mean? Do I understand this correctly? And little things like that. Many times people just want to be heard. And that goes a long way. Now, in terms of that's the easy part, the positive part. Now I'm going to give you, then we should end on a positive, more positive thing. But I'm going to give you I'm going to be very forthright in my speech with you about this. So that's the other thing. You always want to be forthright in your speech. You want to respect the believer, but be ruthless on the belief. And so the Greeks have a term, speaking truth in the face of danger, parrhesia, being honest, being open, don't be sneaky. So those are things you can do personally. The bad news to that is that I do not believe our institutions are capable of being reformed. I do not believe our institutions of higher ed are capable of being reformed. I don't believe the ACLU is capable of being reformed. I don't believe the SPLC, I don't believe almost any organization, and I put out a tweet a little while ago, what institutions are actually working? What do people trust? And the further you go from merit, the less likely people are to trust those institutions. But we have a whole host of other problems. I think we're seeing now, and I think this is the first time I mentioned this, I'm involved in building new institutions. Yes, that is a tweet that someone should absolutely, that is a video that someone should absolutely watch, because again, what's happening in that video, that is a feature of the system. It is not a bug of the system. So I'm involved in new institutions that forward free speech, free inquiry, open exchange of ideas, etc. So I think that I think the internet has done a wonderful job of leveling the playing field and destroying old institutions, whether it's, record labels or, traditional media empires, ABC, CBS, NBC, when we grew up, right? Now I think that we're going to see with the emergence of these new institutions, and the one I'm involved in is in Austin, Texas. You're going to see the parallel architectures emerge, and you're going to see people students and parents attempt to choose institutions that better display their values. The other thing is, if you look at the data, I just read this, and the data changes, but I think it was 80%, depending on how you parse it, of people who are conservatives don't trust our public educational institutions. My claim to you would be, if they actually knew what was happening in the public institutions, that would be 99%. So that's the other reason that we need to make a lot of these things public. So we have the personal. I'm extremely hopeful on the personal level of what we can do in our own lives. I'm much less hopeful. I have zero hope in terms of our academic institutions. They've crumbled. They've been corrupted.
Right. Yeah, but you have certain institutions that I'm really worried about because they certify other institutions, like the American Bar Association, which appears to be corrupted. American Medical Association, as
AMA is corrupt.
Yeah,
JAMA is corrupt. New England Journal of Medicine.
Those are the people that decide who the doctors, lawyers are. And isn't there a real danger when those institutions go that you can't really replace them so easily, or maybe you can in the long run, but you're stuck with them for decades before you're going to have another institution with the legitimacy to determine who your next doctors or lawyers are?
Yeah, two things on that. I have a friend of mine who's entering medical school, Oregon Health Science University. He sent me a text. I haven't posted it on Twitter yet, or if I will at all, they basically asked the the adults, the people in medical school, to segregate on the basis of, I can't, identity mark, racial identity mark or something. I don't know the exact words, but this is everywhere. It's in medicine. Look, here's my question to people who are sitting there thinking, I don't see what's wrong with that. Okay, let's say that your child needs an operation. And let's say that this is not, mending a bone, this is something life-threatening. So it's some organ, and the failure could mean death. Wouldn't you want to do everything as a parent to increase your odds that your child would live? I think every parent would say yes. Literally every parent.
Right.
And wouldn't you want to know that the person who was performing the surgery was rigorously tested and was there on the basis of their merit? I think every parent would say yes. So you wouldn't want equity in a medical system. So you wouldn't want to forward some characteristics at the expense of merit. So we have the solutions to these problems. And these are to make equality is, for example, equal school systems. All the talk about equity, name a single school in a poor Black neighborhood that's been fixed or given adequate funding in the last 2 years as a result of all this equity talk. There is none.
Right.
So we know the solution is, and this is, I think, a wake-up call to conservatives. If you're a conservative, you have to have an honest conversation about increasing taxes, progressive tax rates, et cetera, and funding school. So you can look at this as through an economic lens, or you can look at this through a racial lens. I obviously prefer the economic lens. So you need to start having an honest conversation about what it's going to take to give everybody a public education of the first rate, as a phrase from John Rawls. And when you do that, have equal opportunity for people. But if you try to jerry-rig the system on the outside to, for example, make certain doctors of a certain race or you wouldn't want your son or your daughter to get surgery from a person who's, and who's in a position as something other than their merit.
Right.
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
And the cruel irony is there, not only do you have that side of the problem, but you're also not focused on what could actually solve the problem, which is building the long-term pipeline of doctors and scientists from disadvantaged communities.
Correct.
And you're dealing with the equity in the here and now necessarily deprives you of the kinds of things that would actually bring people into greater equality.
Correct. So that's a positive vision you gave. I don't want to be the naysayer, the negative guy here, but the negative version of that is every time we don't do that and we put equity and we try to jerry rig systems, the deeper our crisis of legitimacy, the less trust people have in the institutions because they don't believe that people arose to those positions as a result of their own merit. They believe that they were kind of given something unearned.
Right.
That's the problem. Well, that's a problem for the crisis of legitimacy. But the other thing we haven't talked about is think about how unfair it is to that person in that position, because people think that they didn't earn their position. That's just inherently unfair to them.
Absolutely. Wow, I could talk to you for a lot longer, and I think people could listen to you for a lot longer. But this has been an incredible conversation, and I'm so glad you're fully freed up.
Yes, thank you.
To really share, to share your views in full, and that you're going to help lead the charge for a more liberal society. And I'm grateful to have you as sort of our philosopher in our field. You bring such depth to these questions, and you keep me on my toes, which I can appreciate. So thank you, Peter, so much for this. And I want to thank our viewers. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. It's a Jewish holiday. It's of Sukkot right now, and a lot of people are celebrating in their sukkahs. So it's really great to be able to do that with you. And thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you. Appreciate your support.